Yeah, thanks for coming to my talk, automating your SALT tests. My name is Ryan Currah. So my experience with SALT, I was the lead SALT engineer for a large Canadian bank. My responsibility was to develop formulas, do the SALT master architecture, SALT Git development strategy, and SALT testing and automation. So just my goal of this talk is to help some of the newcomers to SALT get started off on the right foot. So one of the big things is not to forget to automate testing. If you don't automate testing, it'll definitely become a bottleneck for releasing new formulas and states. If you do automate testing, you'll catch issues early and you'll feel confident when you release changes. So one of the, when looking at testing, kind of want to do kind of similar infrastructure as code, testing as code as well. So I had a few requirements when I looked at doing testing. So one of the requirements was state testing defined as code. We want to test the state using some DSL and then also the jobs defined as code as well. So the tool that we use to create the jobs to test had to be defined as code, no going into UI and clicking buttons. Pipeline capabilities, so we want to be able to do our job all, do our build, QA, and promotion all in one job. None of that spaghetti code or spaghetti jobs. Wanted fast testing feedback for developers who are developing formulas, so they'll know when their changes will get merged into master, if it will pass. Another thing is the tools had to be on premise for us. So the testing tools that I selected use some code analysis. So for Bash we used shell check. For Python we used Flake 8. And state testing I used server spec, and I used containers to create that fast iteration or fast feedback. And then I used Docker for that. Testing orchestration, we used Jenkins pipeline. It's formerly known as workflow. And for versioning, we use git tag plus a tool called bump version. So for code analysis on formulas, it's not uncommon to see scripts in formulas. So code analysis enables you to enable good coding style, consistency, express how we want code to be written. Another thing is I've seen some people try to commit formulas that have Jinja templated scripts. So my recommendation, if you use the code analysis, it'll catch that and error out. So I recommend you use command.script with input arguments instead. Another thing was testing state. So why do we want two different views of state? Sometimes it's good to kind of audit SALT's view of state. So there's an example, there was an issue with file.copy state with force equals true where it didn't work. It reported no changes when the file should have changed. When we run server spec tests, it actually caught that issue, so we didn't push the change out. Another thing is you can audit formula changes. So if someone changes something to a formula, the test will capture that. So with server spec, what can you test? So you can test quite a few things out of the box. You can test if a process is running, service is running, file hashes. There's a lot more resource types if you look at the link below. Another thing is server spec, you can create reusable tests. They're called shared files. So you can, like a process name doesn't change or a service name doesn't change. So you could potentially reuse those tests elsewhere. So one of the biggest things was jobs as code. Jenkins pipeline enables jobs as code in a delivery pipeline. So like I said earlier, without the spaghetti jobs, you might have a build job and a QA job. This allows you to have it all in one script. So in the root of your SALT formula repository, you'd have a file called a Jenkins file. It's a Groovy script. And the pipeline has stages. You can create any stage names you want. For the demo, I used build, QA, and production. And the pipeline has visualizations and metrics, so you can kind of view how the health of the pipeline is. So the things you can see is like average build time, current build time, stage views, failed steps. So some of the Jenkins plugins I used were the pipeline multi-branch. So the pipeline multi-branch plugin allows you to have multiple jobs per branch. So if you have a feature branch, they'll have a job just for that, and then a master branch, a job just for that. The pipeline remote loader plugin, so this actually allows you to reuse the same Jenkins file script for multiple formulas. So I found that the workflow for the testing job for all the formulas that I used were pretty much the same. So I just reused the same Jenkins file script and used the pipeline remote loader to bring it in. And so you only have to update the Jenkins file in one spot. We also use the Git plugin, which just allows you to clone a Git repository and also adds the ability for webhooks from your Git server to notify Jenkins to start a build. The SSH agent plugin, which allows you to push changes back to the Git server, like in this demo, tags. And then the ANSI color plugin makes your output look a little nice. So the Jenkins server setup, you'll have to install Docker. You have to have Docker allow Jenkins user to run it. And then you need a testing container, and this is where you kind of get that fast feedback, where you have the systemd pre-installed, the salt minion pre-installed, all your testing tools pre-installed on the container, and bump versions installed on the Jenkins server, and then it gets Git SSH credential for pushing tags back to Git server. So this is a bit of an issue running services in containers. Containers aren't really meant to have multiple processes running in them. So there is a way to get that to work. You have to install systemd in the testing container if it already isn't. You have to remove systemd links from etc systemd. You have to mount, when you go to run your container, you have to mount the C groups from the host to the container, read-only. And then you have to run the container as privileged, or you can mount temp from the host to /run on the container. And actually, Red Hat pushed a change to Docker where you won't need to do any of this anymore. So that step won't be necessary in newer versions of Docker. And then you have to run user sbin and init to make systemd PID1. So formula repositories, this has been talked a little bit about at this conference by some of the other people. Just got some quick notes. So basically you create a repository for each formula. Repositories should have test folders with all your tests in them. Nice thing about having formula repositories is you release updates independent of other states. So once you start using Salt, you'll probably have like a monolithic a repository of all your states in there. It actually makes it really hard to start testing everything independently as a unit. So eventually, if you already do this or you're looking at creating a repository for your states, I'd recommend creating independent repositories for each formula. And then you can use Git backends for the formulas. Some people have been packaging the formulas as like debs or RPMs. The branching strategy that I use is called GitHub Flow. So that's where you actually create features off of master, and you develop your feature until when it's ready, you create pull requests back into master. And so for this, you have good testing, unit testing, and integration tests. And this is just kind of developing locally is pretty important when you're starting up your your Salt infrastructure and you're bringing on developers to help you develop JBoss formulas or Oracle formulas. It's good to give them like an environment to develop them in. So definitely provide them a local development environment. Create a Vagrant box or a Docker image. If you're using RHEL right now, they just in the last few weeks they have the developer licenses free now, so you can actually have a like for like a development environment if you're using RHEL in your environment. Another thing is you provide an example formula of tests. So give them an idea of what the layout should look like of the repository. Also document how to get started, probably self-explanatory there. And make sure Jenkins does feature testing for them. So what's a good pull request? There's some Salt best practices. Some of the ones I like are less Jinja the better. No Jinja whitespace control characters in SLS files. You don't need to do those little ticks to control whitespace. Another thing is defaults. Use defaults in your formulas. One thing I found is people, like in my experience, people will kind of rely on pillars a little too much. So if a pillar doesn't exist, a pillar like key doesn't exist, the state will fail. So just remember, pillars are for overriding defaults, in my view. Another thing is predictable and sane state IDs. This will allow you to do some analytics with something I'm going to talk about a little later about state events. Another thing is obviously you have to require the test to pass in Jenkins. When you're reviewing code together, so review code together, review with the person who did the development. Look for potential bugs, readability, test coverage. So somebody's added a new state, make sure they have a corresponding server spec test that will check that state is working. Complement and reinforce good practices. So just
Did you want questions as you went through it in Mach 3, or do you want us to wait till the end?
Sorry?
Did you want questions like?
Yeah, I'll be at the end. We'll do some questions. Releasing new salt formulas. When you're releasing new salt formulas, use semantic versioning. Well, that's what I used. So there's a good guide on semantic versioning at semver.org. And then you'd want to tag releases. Tag new version 0.30. Retag latest, so repoint latest to the newest version. If you use bump version, it will automatically bump the formula version for you. And then if you have to roll back to the latest, you can do that if you need to a previous version. And then if the salt master, you can use the GitFS backend to use to get the latest formulas. So I have a bit of experience with using the Git backends, the two of them, sorry, PyGit and Git Python. So PyGit 2, it supports authentication, but I found that during the cloning process it would hang, so you would find out-of-date masters with the salt formulas. If you're and then Git Python, it's pretty easy to install. The problem is there's no authentication supported. So if you don't need authentication for your formulas, to clone your formulas, I'd recommend to use Git Python. So it's going to do a quick demo of the Jenkins pipeline. So I was going to show you two files here. This is the Jenkins file on the right. This is what you would find in your formula repository at the root. And basically you just have to declare the name of your formula and then load in your Jenkins script or Groovy script from like a remote source. So I used this here, and so this is the main script used for running the tests. So one thing you'll notice, you'll see these kind of like Jenkins own DSL in the Groovy script here. So you got this concept of a stage. So you got build, and then everything in this stage you do related to a build. So here we're like starting a Docker container, we're running our code analysis, we're setting up the test environment, we install our gem file to install server spec on the container, and then we run our high state to install to run the states. And then you have the QA stage, and this is where you run server spec. So you do Docker exec and run your tests. And then if that passed, so you'll notice that there's some if statements here. If the branch name is master, it will continue on to the production stage. So this is where you actually do your release of the formula. So you get the current version, you bump the version, you retag latest, and then you push it back to the Git server. So go to the Jenkins UI. So here is the multi-branch pipeline job. So you can trigger this job from your Git server if it's GitHub or Bitbucket. It will automatically create these jobs here, and each job here is a branch in my repository. So you can see there's a feature branch, and you notice how there's only 2 stages here. Because of that if statement, it's not showing, it won't run the production stage and you won't see it in the UI. So here you can see, like I said, some of the statistics like the build time for each stage. You can see, and here each row represents a build number. And then for the QA, you can see the logs for the QA. You can actually click here and see each step that was ran in that stage. So for the master, you're going to notice there's the extra stage, production. And here it's kind of the same to see all the stages, all the time it took. Another thing that's nice, if a job fails, it's really easy to kind of see at what stage it failed in and what step. So it kind of highlights here where it failed. And if you click on the logs, it actually show you the exact step that failed. So right here, this failed to bump the version. Yes, and so let's start a build there and I'll continue on. Okay, state events. What is a state event? A state event is a result of a state execution in a structured format that can be parsed. Why would you want state events? Analytics on state execution results, alert operations on failed states, easily compile issue reports for engineering. To use state events, you have to use the event returner. The event returner is only run on the Salt master. Salt has a list of event returners, or you can build your own. In this case, I created my own returner, and if you create your own, you place them in _returners directory in your state tree, or so your file roots. And then the returner state events are basically state.sls and state.highstate events. And then I add the minion ID and the job ID to the state return data for correlating state events to a specific host or action. So here's an example of a state event. This is Splunk, and so we're extending HTTP events to Splunk to Splunk, and it's doing automatic field extractions. So you'll see here on the left the JSON response that we sent to it, or the JSON structure that we sent to it. It's automatically creating field extractions, and so you can actually search on each of these keys as a field in Splunk automatically without creating field extractions, which is kind of nice. So let's just do a quick demo of this. I'm going to run a high state on my minion here, and it's going to fail. Some states are going to fail and some states are going to pass, and it's should show up in Splunk. Let her in there. Well, I'll just go back to previous data that we have since it's not running. But so if you look here, so what happens is when a state executes, they get returned to each state that gets ran gets sent back to Splunk as an event. So you can actually see here we got like result false, the state ID, the comment, and you can actually see the changes if there are any. So what you can do with this data is you can actually start creating dashboards or alerts for operations or the engineering team. So we got a little dashboard here that shows kind of like the state execution results, true or false, if it failed, the top 10 states by number of executions, and then a table of failed executions, the state names with the number of times an execution might have failed. So that kind of helps get you visibility to kind of how Salt's running in like production or wherever you have it. So all the code that I did for this demo is available on my GitHub page. So if you want to look at the pipeline and play around with that, you can get the pipeline on my GitHub page. The Splunk HTTP returner is up there too. And then some of the other examples. Oh, sorry, I'll get that up if you want to take a picture.
Can't write that fast.
Problem. Is there any questions?
You said you talked, as far as GitFS for your masters for pulling in formulas. I was wondering how well that scaled out for you.
So we had about 12 masters, sorry. It worked okay. Like when we used Git Python, it seemed to be fine. I had no issues.
Sorry, how many different repos you were pulling with
Oh.
Python or probably Git 2? You probably have a ton of formulas, and I'm just wondering if you hit a wall, and if so.
So the question is, did we hit a wall by using a lot of formulas in Git Python backend? So I didn't have a chance to see that before I left where I was working. So it's
What was the largest number you separated?
probably like 10 or 15. Yeah.
Did you try that many with Python 2?
No, because once I found that Pygit 2 was hanging, I stopped using it. So.
Having no option.
And the one thing I saw at the conference this year that was very cool was people were packaging formulas into like debs or RPMs, which I think seems like a pretty good idea. Over there?
Let's say you have a generic state that you're including in a lot of states.
Yeah.
And in one of those states that's including that one, you need a new feature, a new state to be added to that generic one. So you need to go back and update that and come back to update this one. So you will have two separate repositories that are going to work together.
Yeah.
You need to kind of test them together.
Yeah, you kind of layer them together, so you will, when you want to run your formulas together, wherever you're going to like create your build, you'll just declare all the formulas that you want, and then your own top file for that. Seth?
The Splunk returner, do you have any recommendations for how to use Splunk do the defaults work well out of the box, or do you have any additional tips for making good use of Splunk with Salt?
Yeah, so the question was, do I have any tips for making good use of Splunk with Salt? That was it, right?
Yeah.
So one thing is, with the newer version of Splunk, they got added a new data input capability, which is the HTTP event collector, which I find works really well with Salt, like sending data from Salt. Another thing is you want to turn on for your JSON fields, you want to turn on like KV mode, which will actually do that field extractions for you automatically. So like I was showing you how you could search the fields. If you turn on the KV mode, it will automatically do the field extractions, which makes it a lot easier to use the Salt events with Splunk. So you can see here they're automatically being showing up on the left-hand side.
How much resources do your whole entire stack use on your laptop?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I use a gig for each Vagrant, 2 Vagrant VMs, one for Jenkins and one for Splunk.
So you're comfortable, what kind of laptop are you running on?
This is 12 gigs of RAM, and I'm not sure it's like an i5 processor or something. Sorry?
So my question is, so you're deploying the formulas on a separate Jenkins pipeline.
Yep.
Or is it tied somehow to the deployment of the application itself?
No. So that question was, is the build pipeline tied to the deployment of the application itself? And the answer is no. When you do the build, you're just releasing new formulas which can be used by your applications in the, like the developers or whoever in the, when they're building out their infrastructure.
So the follow-up question is, how is actually used for like application development? How is their pipeline different that use those sole formulas?
So the question was, how do you use the pipeline for application development?
Yes, so I assume that those sole formulas are used for deploying configurations for the for a particular environment for a particular application.
Yeah. So in my experience at the bank I was at, we were building formulas for like platforms. So we're building them strictly for JBoss, Oracle, WebSphere, and then the developers would layer their changes on top of that independently. So we would just be providing the base like platform for developers to use.
How do you feel about calling out to other formulas? Like you have a separate formula to deploy like load generators that you would use in your QA tests. Is that
Like do some sort of, so the question was like kind of like integration testing with other
Yeah.
formulas?
yeah, if you wanted to have a stage where you're doing QA testing and you want to hit a bunch of URLs and know that everything is working, you QA test, but you also maybe wanted to be able to deploy those load generators outside of just doing your automated build testing so that you could do your larger scale load testing with the same formula. Does that sound like a bad idea or a good idea?
I haven't done that yet, so I'm not really sure how to answer that, but I am looking at that kind of like testing like kind of like the orchestration. So like when we start using Salt with orchestration tools, how do we test our changes with what we're going to use the Salt formulas for in the orchestration, right? So something I still have to answer, work on. Anything else? Yep.
When you're running the several stages, so first you run the build stage, and then you run a Q&A, where you're running your tests. Are you just validating that the state run is true, or in that it failed, or are you checking, for example, is the package actually installed?
Oh, yeah, let me show you some of the tests that I have. So, sorry, the question was, how do I, like, what are my tests doing? Are they testing if the package is actually installed? So I'll just show my service spec tests. And so this is a service spec test. This is a shared one, which is reusable. So there's like a little bit of a DSL here that they have where you can check the state to see if a package is installed. In this case, HTTPD. See if a user exists, check its UID, checking if files exist, and then once that runs, you get a little bit of a report. I'll show you so this is the output of the test here. Apache tests, and then down at the bottom they have, they tell you how many tests there were and how many failed. And if the tests fail, obviously Jenkins will fail out the build.
Okay. You still haven't made the test reporting report for the pipeline, have you?
Sorry?
You just get the text that it failed or not, and the exit code, of course, will tell Jenkins that it failed or not.
Yeah.
I've tried to use the pipeline plugin,
Yep.
and I still haven't made it work because I cannot, for example, use the XUnit reports.
Oh, the JUnit reports?
For example.
Yeah.
You're not using anything like that. You're just
Yeah.
relying on the exit code for now.
Yeah, well, I used to use, when I did the jobs manually, we did use JUnit reports, and then to get the pipeline working, I abandoned using JUnit reports for now, and then I'm gonna look into getting them to work later. But as long as the tests fail, obviously you exit out with a failure, and the test will stop. And the pipeline, it does give you a decent view of, like, you can pretty quickly find the issues. But yeah, that's definitely something I still gotta look into. No problem.
I was asking,
Go ahead.
how do you organize your kind of suite of tests you bring up? The machine and run on all your states, then check them? Do you kind of like bring up different ones, different configuration?
Yeah, so for this, we just bring up a single formula, and you can, one thing you should probably do is like integration testing, which is like, in my opinion, like using different pillar overrides to test different like values in the state. That's pretty much all I do is just testing the state itself, the formula itself. Not really kind of doing any like testing two formulas at once right now. So.
Why not even just like the same thing with a different configuration?
Oh yeah, so that's where this is. Sorry, yeah. That's where maybe you might want to do a little more integration testing where you, like, so here's like a folder where you just have like the defaults. There'd be nothing in the pillars. Like there's nothing in the pillar right now for the default test. But then you want to start like creating more tests, and you override certain paths maybe, or maybe a different version of a package or something like that.
And so that pipeline,
And then in the pipeline, they actually have a way you can do concurrency, so you can run multiple commands at the same time. So you could like potentially, run all these integrations in parallel, integration tests.
I have one more question. Did you know, I noticed you were bringing up like a documented running with salt call kind of directly. Did you look at all of Vagrant's built-in salt provision? Did you like dislike that, or because I've seen setups where like they use that to run some instead of.
So I was using. The question was, did I look at the salt provisioner for Vagrant? So I didn't use. I want to use Docker, or not Docker, but containers for the testing because it'll be a little faster feedback. So I never really looked at the Vagrant provisioner for Salt. The one thing I did look at though was Test Kitchen, and I want to use that to run my integration tests. But I found that the Kitchen Docker driver hasn't been updated in a while, so yeah. So I just went and did it manually. Yeah.
It got boring. It got boring.
It's getting updated. It's just not getting, a new gem isn't being released. Yep.
So what the people who actually use those formats to make mistakes for JBoss or basically like a platform things, right? How do they test the overall result?
Sorry, how would you?
Oh, how do they test the overall result? So let's say
Yeah.
repository formats being tested, you test it all good.
Yep.
So now I use a couple of formats to create my JBoss, like the state that will create me a JBoss installation.
Yeah.
How do you test that?
So if you're not using Salt for your orchestration like we were doing, you have like a different tool, and in that tool it's code as well. Something like if you're using Terraform or Cloudify or something, you'd create your own repository for those blueprints, and then when you run those blueprints, you actually have tests for those as well. So when you launch your infrastructure, you can, or launch those blueprints, sorry, you can run those tests there as well. So it's testing kind of like all the way up the stack there. They just won't, these are just for the Salt formulas, so yeah. All right, I think that's it. Please provide feedback. Use the SaltConf 16 app to provide feedback for this presentation, and thank you for coming.